you ever dreamed of exploring another world? Could you witness something new? Push boundaries? Or reach for your greatest hope? The experience of every generation is yours. On the History Channel, where the past comes alive.
Americans love to make lists. The books that sell the most, the teams that win the most, movies that earn the most. Now, here at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., they've made the list that matters most to American history. It's called the 100 Milestone Documents, the 100 most significant records in American history. Millions of papers, parchments, films, even videotapes were considered, and the enormous task of selecting the top 100 fell to the staffs of the National Archives, National History Day, and the USA Freedom Corps. Now, over the next hour, we'll reveal the top 10 defining documents in American history as selected by you, the American people. And we'll uncover the intriguing stories behind a few entries we thought you'd like to know more about. Beginning with 10 essential amendments that were lost and then found.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
They are the original 10 commandments of our democracy.
Or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press.
To assemble and petition the government.
The guarantee that the life,
the accused shall enjoy the right
to a speedy and public trial.
And liberty of every American.
The powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution
is protected from the awesome power of government.
Are reserved to the states respectively or to the people.
When the United States Constitution was written in 1787, it touched off a fierce debate between the Founding Fathers. Did the Constitution give too much power to the federal government? Several states, including Rhode Island and North Carolina, refused to ratify the document until it was changed. After 2 years of wrangling, 12 amendments, known as the Bill of Rights, were passed by Congress.
We think that the Bill of Rights says we have the right to do this. Well, in most cases, it doesn't say you have the right to do this. It says that the government doesn't have the right to do this. And so it really is a prohibition on what it is that the government can do.
14 handwritten copies were made. The federal government kept one, and the others were sent to the original 13 states with this cover letter from President George Washington. The states ratified 10 of the 12 amendments.
The document that we hold at the National Archives that is the Bill of Rights is the original joint resolution that includes all 12 of the proposed amendments. And as far as, where's the document that includes just the 10, there isn't one.
Each copy was a valuable piece of history. The federal government held on to its copy, but the states did not fare so well. 5 states, Pennsylvania, New York, Maryland, Georgia, and North Carolina, eventually reported theirs lost or missing. Hopes for recovering these milestone documents seemed dim until January of 2003, when Joseph Torcella, then president of the National Constitution Center, heard his phone ring.
Hello? We got a call through a series of folks from a benefactor who had been approached by someone about an original Bill of Rights, and he called us and called Pennsylvania's governor.
The seller was Wayne Pratt, a Connecticut-based antiques dealer. Pratt and a partner had bought the document from 2 sisters for $200,000. They claimed that it had been in the family for 3 generations. If it was an original, the 27 by 31-inch document was estimated to be worth $30 million. Pratt was offering to sell it to the museum for the bargain price of $4 million.
Given our mission, how could we not be interested in trying to do this?
And there was always the hope that it might be Pennsylvania's missing copy of the Bill of Rights. Crack told the museum that he could not identify the origins of the document.
We initially proceeded on the basis that we were getting a document whose origins were simply not clear.
The National Constitution Center asked experts at George Washington University to authenticate the document.
The tool that we used to identify that copy and figure out which state it belonged to was the docketing information.
Docketing was a handwritten filing system on the back of documents, which revealed each clerk's individual style.
This is the docketing, the copy that we received, and this is a copy of docketing from Maryland. This one's from Georgia, and you can see that it's quite different. And then this is Pennsylvania. Again, not a lot of similarities. Then we got to the docketing on the letter that George Washington actually sent with the Bill of Rights to the governor of North Carolina. And there are many similarities. This 1789 in the middle with the 7 and the 9 coming down below the line. The word "the" was written with a very tall T and a very tall H. Then you look at the U in United States right here, and also the U in United States there. So we were very quickly convinced that the document belonged to the state of North Carolina.
All that the National Constitution Center needed to do before buying the Bill of Rights was to get the blessing of the state of North Carolina.
We felt that the most appropriate thing to do, since it appeared to be North Carolina's, that we would not acquire it without their consent.
Governor Mike Easley received a call from Governor Rendell in Pennsylvania and said, hey, someone's trying to sell to our state or to the museum there a copy of North Carolina's Bill of Rights, and do you want to go in on it? And the governor told the governor of Pennsylvania, no, we're not going to buy anything that's ours.
North Carolina's copy of the Bill of Rights was stolen from this room in the state capitol by a Union soldier during the Civil War. And according to legend, he sold it for $5 to a man he met in Indiana. Over the next 138 years, the document occasionally resurfaced, but each time it was offered for sale, North Carolina balked.
North Carolina always has maintained that this document belongs to the people of North Carolina and that we will not purchase it back.
This time, the state hatched a plan with the U.S. Attorney's Office and the FBI to get the Bill of Rights back. The plan hinged on the cooperation of the National Constitution Center.
We felt like it was the right thing to do. We'd been asked by the government to cooperate in getting this into the hands of the court.
Attorney Steve Harmelin was asked to represent the museum in the sting.
I was a little concerned and wasn't sure what I was about to embark upon.
If something went wrong, the document could disappear, along with the National Constitution Center's reputation and $4 million.
I understand we were a few months from opening a $185 million museum. It was the last thing we sort of, had planned.
I look back on the night before, wandering around my home, trying to go through all the things that I thought were necessary to happen the next day in order to simply preserve the safety of the document. Our whole focus was make sure that document doesn't disappear for another 140 years, because it wouldn't survive.
The next day, March 18th, 2003, was a chance to reclaim history. The sting was to take place in Harmelin's office.
When we arrived in our offices, we had the offices prepared the way we would have for any financial closing. There were the documents were all laid out on the table. And we also had asked our expert to come, so he would be there to verify that, in fact, the document being delivered was the one he had inspected previously. In addition, there were a number, probably 5 or 6 FBI agents in the conference room adjacent to where we had set up for the financial closing.
Frankly, it was quite a surreal event. It was quite like a drug transaction where the drug dealer would first say, "Show me the money," and then I will produce the dope. In this case, the attorney showed up without the document, without the Bill of Rights, wanted to be satisfied that the contract documents were accurate and that the check was there. Once satisfied that he saw the money, he made a phone call. Within a matter of minutes, a courier arrived with, astoundingly, the Bill of Rights in a cardboard box.
They opened the cardboard box, and there, covered by a thin plastic cover, was the actual Bill of Rights. Seeing it there was an awesome experience. We checked the document for its accuracy, and when satisfied that it was in fact the document that we believed it to be, I left the room on the assumption that I was getting the executives at the National Constitution Center to come in and sign the papers and proceed with the closing. Instead of that, I just knocked on the door of the next conference room, and that was the signal for the FBI to go into the room and recover the document, which they did.
The fate of this copy of the Bill of Rights was now in the hands of the Federal District Court in North Carolina. After 6 months of negotiations, Wayne Pratt agreed to give up all rights and return it to the people of North Carolina free of charge.
It means so much more to the people of North Carolina because North Carolina and Rhode Island were the two states who would not approve of the Constitution without a Bill of Rights.
Now, there are 10 copies. And on the subject of 10, you may be wondering about the 2 amendments that were not ratified. Well, one had to do with congressional pay, and the other with the number of people each congressman would represent. Had this passed, there would be some 6,000 congressmen in the House of Representatives instead of 435. Just imagine that. And now, the results of the people's vote. Over 300,000 votes cast online at ourdocuments.gov for the top 10 documents in American history. Coming in at number 10, the Social Security Act, and at number 9, the Civil Rights Act. It's the document that ignited the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s.
God has spoken to me.
Influenced the women's movement of the 70s and the gay rights movement of the 80s and 90s. And was at the heart of some of the most contentious issues and monumental changes in American society.
Brown versus Board of Education is a court ruling that says no more. Says very significantly, no more will segregation be legal.
Brown versus the Board of Education is not only a milestone document, but a turning point in American history. The 1954 Supreme Court ruling abolished laws designed to keep blacks and whites apart. Though, as we're about to see, the outcome did not completely bring us together.
How are y'all feeling today?
Friday morning at the Baton Rouge Center for the Visual and Performing Arts starts with a school sing-along. It is the vision of integration pictured in the aftermath of Brown. Across town at the Capitol Middle School, a different picture. The student body here is 99.5% African American.
We've gone from a school system that was about 70% white, 30% African American, to a school system today that is 73, fast on the way to 75, 76% African American.
This classroom is reminiscent of Southern schools before the 1954 court ruling, when there were 2 Americas. Black and white had separate schools, separate restaurants, even separate bathrooms, all owing to the 1896 Supreme Court decision, Plessy versus Ferguson, which adopted the doctrine of separate but equal.
The prevailing separate but equal doctrine really meant that because African Americans had no political power, they could never have equal resources for the education of their kids.
The movement to undo Plessy gained momentum in the 1920s. To win public support, the NAACP produced films to illustrate the inequalities between black and white schools. The NAACP used these disparities as the basis for a series of legal cases to point out a contradiction in the Plessy equation. If equality was not being achieved, then why was separation being enforced?
The actual decision in Brown was the culmination of probably 2 decades of litigation that were taking the court step by step up to Brown.
When it agreed to hear Brown versus the Board of Education in 1952, the U.S. Supreme Court bundled it with 4 other cases related to public school segregation. They collectively became known as Brown because that was the first name on the docket. For the NAACP, the moment of truth had arrived. In a departure from past strategy, its legal team, headed by future Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall, decided to stake the case on moral grounds.
This was a huge risk because prior to this, Marshall and the NAACP took cases to court, to federal court, to say it's not equal, it's separate but not equal, so you have to change the system. But in taking on Brown, he went after the whole idea of segregation being unfair. Not anything to do with separate but equal any longer. That segregation itself was wrong.
Marshall and his team used findings by social scientists to show that segregation put one group at a distinct disadvantage in life. But would the court agree?
Racial segregation in public schools ruled unconstitutional. The law of the land.
On May 17, 1954, the Supreme Court, under Chief Justice Earl Warren, handed down its verdict, a unanimous 9-0 decision in favor of Brown.
Brown versus Board opened America to the idea that racial segregation was an evil that had to be remedied.
Not only in schools, but in restaurants, swimming pools, restrooms, buses, and the workplace. Brown was a watershed.
I think it led directly to the women's rights movement. I think it led directly to the gay rights movement. I think it led directly to a host of really critical civil rights laws.
Brown was about education, yes, in its specifics, but in its theory and in its important legacy. It was about the importance of humanity and human beings and dignity. That's what it was about.
Winning the ruling in Brown proved a lot easier than making integration work in practice. In 1956, 2 years after Brown, a case was brought against the East Baton Rouge School District by the NAACP. A new school, built in a black neighborhood, had been assigned to mostly white children.
And black kids who lived in that neighborhood were then reassigned to another black school in North Baton Rouge.
Rona Wilford was one of the children named in the suit.
Our parents recognized that we were not getting the kind of education that they worked so hard for us to achieve.
In the wake of Brown, the solution seemed obvious. Let the black kids stay in their neighborhood school. But that's not how it worked out.
Judge E. Gordon West, who presided over this case for about 15 to 18 years, was very hostile to the whole idea of desegregation. So he essentially became an impediment in the process.
The case dragged on for 47 years and was finally settled in August of 2003. By that time, most of the white students had left the school system, moving to the suburbs or to private schools. Today, the racial makeup in the classrooms at Capitol Middle School looks a lot like it did 50 years ago.
All the children look the same, the mix is the same, and the facility is the same. It's not a whole lot different.
It's a story repeated in cities around the country. 22 of the 25 largest central city public school districts in this nation have predominantly non-white student bodies. Segregation as a matter of consequence, not law.
So Brown in many ways remains an aspiration, a goal that we have not yet fulfilled.
What Brown accomplished has advanced the focus of education from the issue of who is allowed to sit in the classroom to the more important issue of what children need to learn.
All that black parents wanted for their children were equal opportunities in education.
One might assume that the 100 milestone documents of American history are all on paper. But the list includes voices and images selected from tens of thousands of feet of film, video, and audio tape preserved at the National Archives. One voice that made the list came all the way from outer space. On October 4th, 1957, in the middle of the Cold War, the Soviet Union, led by Nikita Khrushchev, launched Sputnik, the first man-made object to orbit the Earth. The space race was on.
It was very definitely a race. I mean, first of all, Nikita Khrushchev had declared it a race.
On May 25th, 1961, President John F. Kennedy laid out the finish line.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
It was an optimistic, even astounding goal. 5 weeks earlier, Soviet cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin had become the first man to orbit the Earth. NASA was behind, and the Cold War stakes were enormous.
The Soviet ability to put a person in space before the United States was proof of the superiority of the Soviet society.
Gagarin had orbited the Earth once, flying for over an hour and a half. America's first space flight by Alan Shepard, though successful, lasted just 15 minutes. NASA's next flight by Virgil Gus Grissom lasted 15 minutes and 37 seconds. The daunting task of catching up to the Russians fell to Marine Colonel John Glenn.
Three, two, 1, 0.
Roger, the clock is operating. We're underway.
Godspeed, John Glenn.
On February 20th, 1962, John Glenn blasted off from Cape Canaveral on his mission to orbit the Earth. There was a distinct possibility that neither he nor his spacecraft, Friendship 7, would survive. In the prior 3 weeks, 7 launch attempts had been called off.
Rico. 5 degrees fired, okay.
It is an incredible testament to the heroism and the effort that went into it. You can hear how primitive the systems were.
This is Friendship 7. I have a loose bolt floating around inside the periscope.
I didn't have a single computer aboard on Friendship 7.
Glenn faced a terrifying unknown. Could his body survive that long in space?
They didn't know how he was going to react to the lack of gravity. When you go to read the transcript of his trip, they kept having the doctors ask him over and over, "Are you sure you don't have a headache?"
Friendship 7, this is Canton. Our aeromets would like to hear any comments you have on weightlessness, nausea, dizziness, taste and smell sensations, over.
We had ophthalmologists at that time who were very concerned that when you got into space, your eyes would change shape. They were concerned about when the fluid in the inner ear moved about more randomly. Would that give you disorientation and vertigo?
Any symptoms of vertigo or nausea at all, over? Visual acuity is still excellent. No astigmatic effects. Head movements cause no nausea or discomfort whatsoever, over.
Glenn had no problem seeing, and what he saw was a dazzling vision of Earth.
There's a brilliant blue out on each side of the sun. Horizon to horizon almost. I can see a thunderstorm down below me somewhere.
It's just to be up there and look back and see the Earth from that vantage point in space, to see the Earth's curvature, to see this tiny little thin film of air in which we live. That's so impressive.
Friendship 7 was flying high, orbiting the Earth at over 17,000 miles per hour. But on Glenn's second orbit, Mission Control detected a problem.
Will you confirm that your landing bearing switch is in the off position, over? That is affirmative. Landing bag switch is in the center, off position.
To ground personnel, that meant a possible accidental deployment of the landing bag. The same clips that held the bag held the heat shield. So if the bag was loose, so was the heat shield.
Now, they didn't tell me that at that time, but they asked questions that could only lead me to that conclusion.
You haven't had any banging noises or anything of this type at higher rates?
Negative.
But there wasn't anything could bump except the heat shield if it was loose.
If the heat shield came off, the capsule would burn up on re-entry. Preparing for a worst-case scenario, NASA devised a risky plan.
We are recommending that you leave the retro package on through the entire re-entry.
Glenn's suspicions were confirmed. Under normal conditions, the retro rocket pack, which sits on top of the heat shield, is fired before re-entry and then discarded. The only reason to keep it on would be to hold the heat shield in place.
Nobody really knew what was going to happen.
After 4 hours and 42 minutes and 3 full orbits of the Earth, John Glenn began a manual re-entry.
Go ahead, Cape. You're going out.
We recommend that you...
Glenn was traveling through 3,000-degree heat, protected by a heat shield held on only by the straps of the retro pack. But not for long.
This is Friendship 7. I think the pack just let go.
I was looking back. The heat shield is behind me. I glance out once in a while, and this little orange glow was starting to follow back along the path in which I had just come.
This is Friendship 7, a real fireball outside.
I could see these flaming chunks going back.
Okay, Friendship 7, over.
I wasn't absolutely 100% certain at the time whether it was the retro pack or the heat shield was breaking up.
Okay, Friendship 7, over.
For 4 minutes, ground control heard nothing.
Okay, Friendship 7, do you receive, over?
4 long minutes before they knew whether John Glenn had survived.
Okay, Friendship 7, do you receive, over?
Then.
Roger, over.
Loud and clear, how me?
Roger, loud and clear, how you doing?
Oh, pretty good.
The heat shield had held.
Roger, your impact point is within 1 mile of the uprange destroyer.
John Glenn had completed more orbits than the Soviets, but in the end, the real accomplishment was universal. Fiction had become fact.
If NASA can do this, if John Glenn can do this, then what's next? What else are we capable of doing? I think that in many ways, some of these documents are exciting milestones, not because there's something we pass along the way, but again, because they lead us to something else.
And what it has led to are advances in science felt here on Earth.
In terms of economics and the running of modern life, we really couldn't do without space systems.
Those advances can be traced back to the enthusiasm generated by the crackly sound of John Glenn's voice, the first American to orbit the Earth.
Oh, that view is tremendous.
There is a gold rush in Indian Territory.
We get approximately 40,000 people a day through here.
At casinos like Foxwoods in Connecticut, Native American tribes like the Pequots are hitting the jackpot.
It works because gambling is illegal for everybody else.
And unlike everybody else, Indian casinos are not required to pay taxes, nor are they governed by the same federal, state, or local laws.
There's no question that there are bad feelings that exist between non-natives and native peoples, because non-natives don't understand how they can, in a sense, get away with this.
The answer can be found in dozens of treaties, acts, and speeches stretching back to colonial times.
All of these records and documents are absolutely critical for understanding where we are today.
3 are included on the list of 100 milestone documents. Andrew Jackson's message to Congress on Indian removal in 1830, the 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie, and the Dawes Act of 1887. They all deal with a question that has never been fully answered. Just who controls and owns these lands?
I pledge allegiance to
America thinks of itself as one nation, but that is not strictly true. America is one nation, and 569 federally recognized Indian tribes.
What are tribes? They're sovereign governments. And so it's just like the state.
And some tribes, like the Shinnecock, trace their sovereignty back a long time.
We are one of the oldest self-governing reservations in the United States. We have been here since the beginning, way before the beginning of the United States.
When Europeans arrived in America, they found a native people with a very different philosophy about land.
This notion of land ownership, private property, was something that was completely foreign concept to native peoples.
To settlers, Indians were wasting the opportunity to put that land to good use.
There was this attitude that they were a barbaric, savage, exotic people who were getting in the way of progress.
The white government, in its infinite wisdom, has always looked at us as a problem. The Indian nations are a problem.
The first solution was attempted in 1830 after gold was discovered in Georgia on land owned by the Cherokee and other tribes. Under pressure from prospectors and land-hungry settlers, President Andrew Jackson, in a speech to Congress, endorsed an act of Congress that moved the Indians west of the Mississippi to Oklahoma.
It puts an end to all possible dangers of collision between the authorities of the general and state governments on account of the Indians. It will place a dense and civilized population in large tracts of our country now occupied by a few savage hunters.
It then said, from the highest, from the very top level in the country, that it's okay to push these people away and take their land.
70,000 Indians were moved to open up 25 million acres of land to settlers. On what became known as the Trail of Tears, 4,000 Cherokee died of exposure, hunger, and disease during the 1,000-mile forced march to Oklahoma. Thousands of Seminole Indians and settlers lost their lives in a war that cost the U.S. government almost $60 million. In the East, whites had far outnumbered Indians. But on the Great Plains, proud warlike tribes like the Sioux outnumbered the settlers. So in its next attempt to solve the Indian problem, the U.S. government tried a different approach. The 1868 Treaty of Fort Laramie gave the Sioux their own homeland.
The idea was that there would be certain lands that were reserved for these sovereign nations, and on these lands the government would guarantee to provide some aid.
The Treaty of Fort Laramie established the Great Sioux Reservation, which covered 12.5 million acres across 5 states, including the Black Hills of South Dakota. The treaty made it sound like a permanent deal.
As long as the grass grows, the wind blows, and the water flows, that these lands would be held in memorial for the Indian nations to reside on, and that this treaty cannot be broken.
In exchange for giving up other Indian lands, the United States promised to provide for the education, health, and welfare of the Indians who stayed on the reservation, a promise Indians believe the U.S. government never lived up to.
We have the worst health care of any race of people, any group of people in the United States. We have the shortest life expectancy. We have the highest infant mortality rate.
6 years after signing the Treaty of Fort Laramie, General George Custer led an expedition of miners and surveyors who suspected there was gold in the hills of South Dakota. Their suspicions were confirmed.
When gold is discovered in the Black Hills in the early 1870s, that precipitates a gold rush into what the Lakota perceived as the most sort of sacred land in their homelands. This was an obvious violation of treaties that had been established.
The treaty was declared null and void by an act of Congress in 1877, and the land opened up to settlers. Ever since, the Black Hills have been the subject of a legal dispute that continues to this day.
Whenever interest came in, if it was the settlers, if it was gold, if it was oil, if it was the railroad, the rules changed and they continued to chop, chop, chop.
In 1887, Congressman Henry Dawes of Massachusetts sponsored the next solution, a bill to civilize the Indians.
It is an attempt again to remake the Indian as a white man, to transform Indian communities into farming communities, to have them embrace the notion of private property.
The Dawes Act set aside allotments of 160 acres of farmland or 320 acres of grazing land for the head of every Indian household. The Bureau of Indian Affairs was put in charge of managing these lands and assets.
I want to mention a quote that President Roosevelt gave in 1903. The Dawes Act has done what it was supposed to do. It's pulverized the tribal nations, and it's set aside land for individuals to civilize to make farmers, and then to open up the rest for homestead.
The Dawes Act led to the U.S. government appropriating 90 million acres from Indian tribes, nearly 2/3 of all reservation lands, without providing any compensation.
We tried to assimilate them, we tried to convert them, we tried everything we could. If we couldn't annihilate them, we tried to make them into good white Americans if possible.
In 1934, the administration of Franklin Roosevelt acknowledged the U.S. government's failure to solve the Indian problem. The Dawes Act was rescinded. The Indians were offered a new deal: tribal self-government, the chance to exercise their sovereignty.
Sovereignty is something that Indian people have. We are sovereign. We have the right to do what we do on our lands.
We have complete jurisdiction over our land and our people. And so we oversee the schools, we oversee the health care, we oversee the businesses, everything that happens.
Including control over Indian casino gambling. 201 tribes have some form of gambling, and a few, like the Pequot, are once again flourishing.
The Pequots have a standing today that they had 400 years ago. They are the preeminent businessmen in the region yet again. Instead of wampum, it's gaming.
These are the faces of child labor at the beginning of the 21st century. And these were the faces of child labor at the dawn of the 20th century. They're American, and their misery, captured in photographs, fueled a movement that led to groundbreaking legislation to end the exploitation of children in the workplace. The Keating-Owen Act of 1916.
It's a significant turning point in our thoughts about the importance of preserving childhood. I think that's why it's most important. It's not just about labor, it's the importance of dealing with children as children.
This school and thousands like it across the country are filled with children, due in part to one of the 100 milestone documents. The Keating-Owen Act was passed because of the efforts of a dedicated group of reformers whose tools for change included a relatively new technology, the talents of a teacher from Brooklyn, and the emerging power of mass media. In the early 1900s, children were just another cog in the nation's growing industrial machine. Instead of going to school, 2 million children under the age of 16 went to work in unsafe, unhealthy sweatshops.
If you worked in a textile mill, you were up at 5 o'clock in the morning because you began at 6 a.m. Often quite dangerous work. There was a tendency to want to affect speed-ups, to move the machinery more quickly. So the work became increasingly frenetic.
As is the case today in many developing countries, child labor was used in the United States in the 1900s because it was cheap. And for the children and their families, it was a matter of survival.
When you have a system where the parents are paid below starvation level wages, in many cases they have no choice but their children work.
Leading the call to abolish child labor in America was a group of social reformers, the National Child Labor Committee. In 1908, they hired Lewis Hine to photograph the plight of working children.
The National Child Labor Committee had a very ambitious PR program, and Hine's photographs would go out to the newspapers and magazines.
Louis Hine had been a teacher, and he had extensive experience photographing immigrants on Ellis Island. He knew the faces well.
Hine himself was very aware of the power of his pictures and the power of pictures and text together. He actually coined the term photo story to describe these picture essays that he collaborated on with the different editors of these publications.
Hine spent the next 10 years trolling the dark corners of industrial America. To obtain access, he often had to adopt aliases and phony credentials.
He pretended to be a Bible salesman to gain admittance. He pretended to be an industrial photographer. If he couldn't gain access to a mill or a factory, he would wait outside the factory until the workers were released from their long days.
Hine wrote evocative notes to accompany his pictures.
This boy has just recovered from a second attack of pneumonia. Mind you, not his first attack. It's got to be his second attack. You know, Hines never misses an opportunity, as it were, to pull the heartstrings. Was found selling papers in a big rainstorm. Again, it's never a drizzle, it's a big rainstorm. Hine knew the kind of story he wanted to tell. They're melodramatic pictures. It's a melodramatic story. It's a story of good and evil, of bad guys and good guys.
His images were published in newspapers, where they found a responsive audience. A growing, progressive middle class that believed children should be in school and their mothers at home. And powerful, politically active labor unions, concerned that women and children were undercutting the wages of their members.
If a manufacturer had a choice of firing a worker, he was more likely to fire the male worker who was paid the high wage than the woman worker or the child worker who was paid a lower wage to do the same work. So unions had a real interest in trying to alleviate the problems of child labor and women's labor with protective legislation.
Under political pressure, states began passing child labor laws requiring children to attend school. In 1912, President Taft set up the Children's Bureau to investigate and report upon all matters pertaining to the welfare of children.
If we were ever in a period in the history of the United States when we were ripe for socialism, ripe for communism, that was it. And so you have legislation like the Keating-Owens Act that tries to kind of put a stopgap measure on some of these problems.
In 1916, Congress passed a groundbreaking document. The Keating-Owen Act banned the sale of goods from factories employing children under 14. Children under 16 were not allowed to work in mines or at night. Corporate America could only watch as the machine was overhauled.
So you had folks like Andrew Carnegie and Rockefellers and those big corporate guys who had enormous power, and yet they couldn't forestall the kinds of changes that the progressives were making.
The U.S. Supreme Court overturned the act, but it did not derail the movement for reform. It would take another 22 years before the Fair Labor Standards Act would abolish child labor in factories, mills, and mines.
By 1938, sweatshops were wiped out of the United States, not just child labor.
While children disappeared from America's factories, they remained in our fields. Today, some 300,000 still work as itinerant farm labor. And worldwide, there are an estimated 250 million child laborers.
Like Louis Hine did, only when we put an image, a face on it, and we make it concrete and anecdotal and emotional will things change.
You've heard just a few of the fascinating stories behind the 100 milestone documents. And now it's time to hear from you one last time. According to the vote of the American people, coming in at number 2, the Constitution of the United States. And the number 1 document in American history, according to the American people, the Declaration of Independence. Thank you for your votes and for watching this program. For the History Channel, I'm Josh Binswanger.